Kalends of Sextilis, 98 of our era. The sun over the Eurymedon Valley is a merciless hammer of brass, beating down on the dust-choked road. Here, in the heart of the province of Lycia et Pamphylia, the air itself tastes of baked earth and pine. For Lucius Valerius Aquila, the journey from Rome has been a long torment of jolting carts and suspect provincial inns. But now, as his escort of 4 legionaries from the 7th Legion Claudia rounds the final bend, he sees it, and he understands. Aspendos. It does not rise so much as it erupts from the plains, a formidable acropolis of sun-bleached rock crowned with the beginnings of a great theater and a clutter of civic buildings. Perched nearly 1,000 feet above the fertile valley floor, it is a statement of Roman dominance, a watchtower over the trade routes that are the lifeblood of this region. But it is a thirsty dominance. Lucius dismounts, his joints aching. He is not a soldier. His hands, though calloused, are those of a draftsman and a surveyor, stained with ink, not blood. His title is Architectus, but in truth, he is a water finder, an engineer, a man who sees the world not in terms of borders and legions, but in gradients, pressures, and the unceasing quest of water to find its own level. Awaiting him at the base of the winding path to the city are 2 men. The first, draped in the fine-spun linen toga of a man of status, is Tiberius Claudius Celsus, the provincial governor. His face is a mask of weary impatience. The second is the physical opposite, a slab of pure legionary muscle, his scarred face and graying temples framed by the horsehair crest of a centurion's helmet. This is Marcus Vipsanius Sceva, prefect of the garrison. Aquila, Celsus begins, foregoing pleasantries. You see the problem. He gestures with a sweeping arm, not at the city, but at the landscape. The gods gave us an unassailable fortress. As a cruel joke, they placed the water over there. Lucius follows his gaze. Miles to the north, nestled in the foothills of the Taurus Mountains, he can see the faint green smudge that marks the springs, the proposed source. Between that water and this rock is a chasm, a deep, wide valley carved by the Eurymedon River, a green serpent basking in the heat. A standard aqueduct, the kind that had watered Rome for centuries, was impossible. You couldn't build a bridge of arches across a valley that wide and deep. The cost would bankrupt the province, and the engineering was beyond even Roman skill. We have ration cards, Architectus, Centurion Sceva says, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. My men get 2 litra a day for drinking, washing, everything. The beasts get less. When the summer is at its peak, the cisterns run low. An enemy wouldn't need a siege ram. They would only need to wait. Lucius nods slowly, his eyes scanning the terrain, his mind already a whirl of calculations. He unrolls a small parchment map, but his real work is done with his eyes, gauging the fall of the land, the height of the opposing hills, the sheer scale of the obstacle. They walk the perimeter, the governor complaining of the expense, the centurion pointing out defensive vulnerabilities. But Lucius is silent, his focus absolute. He stops, pulls a wax tablet and stylus from his satchel, and makes a few quick, sharp notes. The grade is too steep for a conventional channel, and the valley is too deep for a viaduct, Celsus says, stating the obvious. The last engineer proposed a series of 30 water-lifting wheels. 30. Can you imagine the manpower? The maintenance? The emperor, our divine Trajan, expects a permanent solution, not a bucket brigade. Lucius finally speaks, his voice dry from the road. Water can be convinced to do many things, Governor. It can be made to turn a mill, to fall in a fountain, or to climb. The centurion Sceva stops walking, turning to face him. A flicker of incredulity crosses his stoic face. Climb? Water does not climb, engineer. It flows down. That is the law of the gods and of nature. Nature has other laws, Lucius replies, his gaze fixed on the distant mountain spring, then back to the parched acropolis of Aspendos. He taps his stylus on the wax tablet, where he has sketched 2 parallel lines descending one slope and rising up the other. If you can confine it, if you can build a vessel strong enough to contain its spirit, you can create a pressure that will drive it where you command. We will not bridge the valley with stone. We will bridge it with pressure. We will bring the river to this mountain in a lead pipe. Governor Celsus stares at him, then at the vast empty air of the valley. With a pipe? You mean to push water uphill from the valley floor to the city? That is madness. No, Governor, Lucius says, a flicker of iron in his voice. It is hydraulics. It is a siphon. He turns to Sceva. Centurion, I will need your strongest men, your best builders, and your most disciplined quarrymasters, and I will need lead, more lead than you have ever seen. He stands there, a lone civilian specialist before two powerful men proposing a solution that sounded like a myth. The sun beat down, the soldiers shifted on their feet, and the fate of the fortress of Aspendos rested on a principle that few men in the world understood. A principle that Lucius Valerius Aquila now had to turn from a drawing on a wax tablet into a miracle of stone and metal. The weeks that followed bled into a rhythm of dust, sweat, and the relentless clang of iron on stone. For Lucius Valerius Aquila, the grand Acropolis of Aspendos became a perch from which he orchestrated a war not against men, but against the very landscape itself. His mornings began before dawn, spent with his team of liberatores, the army's specialist surveyors. They moved like quiet ghosts in the gray pre-dawn light, setting up their instruments. The Corybates, a 20-foot-long wooden beam with a water channel carved into its top, was their god. Lucius would lie flat on the ground, his eye level with the groove channel, watching the water settle into perfect, placid stillness. Only when it was perfectly level would he allow the sighting posts to be marked. From these marks, they measured the drop, foot by painful foot, over miles of unforgiving terrain. He was charting an invisible path, a precise gradient of 1 Roman foot of descent for every 200 feet of travel, a slope so gentle it was imperceptible to the eye, yet absolutely critical for the water's steady, gravity-fed journey from the mountain springs. Centurion Sceva, initially a skeptical observer, quickly became an indispensable partner. He understood logistics and manpower in a way Lucius, the theorist, did not. The legionaries of the 7th Legion Claudia were not just soldiers. They were the finest builders in the empire. Under Scaeva's bellowed commands, they became a human machine. Cohorts were reassigned from patrol duty to the quarries. Auxiliaries from local tribes, wiry men with an innate understanding of the local stone, were hired to supplement the legionary force. The quarry became a vision of Hades. Hundreds of men, their bodies gleaming with sweat under the Anatolian sun, swung mallets and drove iron wedges into the limestone face of the hills. The air was thick with white dust that coated everything, turning beards gray and stinging the eyes. The crack of splitting stone was followed by a chorus of shouts as teams of legionaries using levers and thick ropes maneuvered 1,000-pound blocks onto heavy wooden sledges. Oxen, straining in their yokes, dragged the dressed stones down winding tracks to the construction sites. Lucius had marked out 2 key locations, one on the northern ridge, where the aqueduct channel would arrive from the mountains, and another directly opposite, on the lower slopes of the Aspendos Acropolis. Here, the real work began. Not of channels, but of towers. They are Castella Aquae, Lucius explained to Sceva one sweltering afternoon, gesturing to the rising foundation of the northern tower. Water castles, but they will not hold men. They will hold pressure. Sceva wiped a line of sweat from his brow with a scarred forearm, his gaze fixed on the massive stone blocks being hoisted into place by a timber crane. It looks like you're building 2 watchtowers with nothing to watch. The sentiment was shared by the men. They toiled, following the plans etched onto Lucius's wax tablets, but they did not understand. They were building 2 colossal stone towers, each destined to rise over 100 feet into the air, separated by a mile of empty space. There was no bridge, no arch, just 2 silent sentinels growing on opposing hillsides. The grumbling started in the evenings, over watered wine in the barracks. They called it Aquila's Folly. Lucius was not deaf to the whispers, but he paid them no mind. His world was one of precise angles and cold calculations. He oversaw the masons, ensuring each block was perfectly square and seated in a bed of mortar made from lime and volcanic pozzolana sand, a mixture that would harden like rock, even underwater. One evening, as Lucius was making his final checks on the rising southern tower, Sceva approached him. The sun was setting, bathing the valley in a soft orange light. "The men are disciplined," the centurion said, his voice low. "They will follow orders, but they are starting to doubt the purpose. They see 2 towers, but no bridge. They fear their work is for a madman's dream. Lucius picked up a discarded length of leather hose used for draining foundation trenches. He held one end up. Imagine this is our aqueduct channel, Centurion, full of water from the springs. He then lowered the middle section to the ground before raising the other end. This is the valley. The hose droops, yes? Sceva nodded, his eyes following the simple demonstration. Now, Lucius continued, taking a small water skin and pouring its contents into the high end of the hose. The water ran down, pooled in the sagging middle, and then as he kept pouring, it began to rise up the other side. It defied Sceva's core belief, climbing against its nature until it trickled out of the other end, which Lucius held just slightly lower than the first. "The water in the high tower," Lucius said, his voice filled with a teacher's quiet passion, "will push the water in the valley. It will force it up the pipe to the tower on this side, so long as this tower is even a single foot lower than the one across the valley. The stone towers are not the bridge. They are the source and the destination. The lead pipes we will lay in the valley, they will be the river." Sceva stared at the water trickling from the hose onto the dusty ground. He looked at the massive, half-finished tower behind them, then across the darkening valley to its distant twin. He saw no madness. For the first time, he saw the shape of a miracle. The grumbling in the barracks would not cease overnight. But from that day forward, anyone who called the project Aquila's Folly in the Centurion's presence earned a week of latrine duty. The work continued, the towers reaching ever higher into the Pamphylian sky. The arrival of the lead was an event in itself, not in grand imperial barges, but in the groaning carts of a dozen different contractors, sourced from mines as far away as Britannia and Hispania. It came in the form of heavy, dull, gray ingots known as pigs, each stamped with the mark of the mine and the imperial procurator who had overseen its smelting. To the legionaries, it was an astonishing hoard of wealth, enough to pay their wages for a decade. To Lucius Aquila, it was the lifeblood of his impossible machine. Under the shade of a massive, purpose-built timber workshop near the valley floor, the real alchemy began. Sceva had assigned his most skilled legionary craftsmen, the immunes, specialists exempt from standard duties, to this task. These were men whose hands were as adept with a soldering iron as with a gladius. Lucius directed the construction of a long, sand-filled trench. Into this sand, the legionaries pressed wooden molds, each 10 Roman feet long, creating semicircular channels. This was the first step in forging the great pipes. The lead pigs were melted down in huge clay cauldrons set over roaring fires, the air shimmering with heat as the solid metal slowly surrendered, transforming into a silvery, viscous liquid. The heat was immense, and the men, stripped to their loincloths, their bodies slick with sweat, worked in a coordinated, rhythmic dance of danger and precision. Using long-handled ladles, they would pour the molten lead into the sand molds. A hiss and a cloud of steam erupted as the liquid metal met the cool, damp sand. It was a perilous job. A single splash of molten lead meant a horrific, disfiguring burn. Once the first half of a pipe had cooled, another mold was placed on top, and more lead was poured to seal the seam, creating a complete, rough cylinder. But a simple cylinder was not enough. "The pressure," Lucius explained to a fascinated Celsus, who had come down from the Acropolis to inspect the work, "will be immense. At the lowest point in the valley, the weight of the water in the towers will try to burst the seams of these pipes. A standard soldered seam will tear apart like wet papyrus." His solution was ingenious, born of a deep understanding of both metallurgy and pressure. Each 10-foot section of pipe was cast with a flange at one end and a corresponding tapered opening at the other. When 2 sections were fitted together, they interlocked. The true magic, however, was in the joining. The legionaries didn't just solder the outside, they packed the interior of the join with a mixture of hot ash and quicklime, creating a seal that would be pressed tighter by the very water pressure it was designed to contain. For nearly a mile, they laid this metal serpent. A trench was dug, carefully graded, from the base of the northern pressure tower, down the steep slope into the heart of the valley, and then up the opposing slope to the southern tower. Laying the pipe was back-breaking work. Each section weighed hundreds of pounds. Teams of men, using ropes and raw muscle, lowered the lead cylinders into the trench. Lucius himself walked the entire length of the line, inspecting every single joint, running his calloused fingers over the cooled seams, knowing that one single flaw, one pinhole leak, could compromise the entire system. The soldiers who had once muttered about Aquila's folly now watched in a kind of hushed reverence. They were no longer just building towers. They were assembling a single, continuous vessel. They were giving the valley a new, man-made artery. They started calling it the fistula, the pipe, but they spoke the word with a newfound respect. As the final section of pipe was lowered into place, connecting the system to the outlet valve at the base of the southern tower, a palpable sense of anticipation settled over the work camp. The towers were complete, magnificent structures of white limestone reaching for the sky. The aqueduct channel, a masterpiece of masonry in its own right, was finished, snaking its way from the distant springs to the top of the northern tower. Everything was ready. All the stone, all the lead, all the sweat of 1,000 men over 2 long years now came down to a single moment. Lucius stood with Governor Celsus and Centurion Sceva at the base of the southern tower, the one that would feed the city. His face, tanned and leaner than when he had arrived, was an unreadable mask of professional calm. But inside, his heart hammered against his ribs. He had checked his calculations 1,000 times. He knew the principles were sound, but theory, scribbled on a wax tablet, was a fragile thing compared to the immense, unforgiving reality of physics. He gave the signal. A runner was dispatched to the northern tower. High above them, a legionary on watch raised a polished shield, flashing it in the morning sun. The signal was returned from the distant tower. Sceva's voice boomed across the site. "Open the sluice!" Miles away, a team of engineers turned a massive wooden capstan. With a deep groan of tortured timber, the gate holding back the water from the mountain springs was lifted. The water, for the first time, entered Lucius Aquila's system. And now, there was nothing to do but wait. The waiting was a unique form of torment. For the first hour, nothing happened. The sun climbed higher, beating down on the silent gathering at the base of the southern tower. Legionaries who had been ordered to stand clear of the pipeline trench lined the upper slopes, their figures still and watchful. Governor Celsus shifted his weight from foot to foot, his earlier skepticism now replaced with a nervous, almost childlike anticipation. Sceva stood motionless, his arms crossed over his armored chest, his gaze fixed on the heavy bronze valve that marked the end of the pipeline. Only Lucius seemed at ease, though his calm was a carefully constructed facade. He was listening. He had his ear pressed against the cold, thick lead of the final pipe section just before the valve. At first, there was only silence, the dull thrum of his own blood. Then he heard it. It was not a rush, not a roar, but a deep subterranean groaning. It was the sound of a giant beast stirring in its sleep. The sound of 1,000 joints, a mile of lead, settling under a new and immense strain. The air trapped within the pipe was being compressed, forced to retreat before the inexorable advance of the water. He straightened up, his eyes meeting Sceva's. He gave a single sharp nod. The serpent was waking. The sounds grew louder, first a series of low moans from deep within the earth as the pipeline shifted fractionally in its trench. Then came sharp, percussive cracks, like a whip snapping, as pockets of compressed air found their way out through minuscule vents Lucius had designed into the upper sections of the system. To the uninitiated, it sounded like the project was tearing itself apart. Several of the governor's aides took a nervous step back. "It is merely breathing," Lucius said, his voice steady, projecting confidence he only partly felt. "The pipe is finding its strength." He walked the first 100 yards up the slope, his eyes scanning the freshly covered earth of the trench. He was looking for the telltale sign of a catastrophic failure, a sudden darkening of the soil, the eruption of a geyser of mud and water. But the ground held. The seams held. His calculations, his metallurgy, his faith in Roman engineering, it was all holding. The true test was at the lowest point of the valley, where the pressure was at its most violent, where the full weight of a 100-foot column of water from the northern tower was trying to rip the lead asunder. From their vantage point, they could see nothing but the serene green valley floor. No explosion of water broke the calm. The river Eurymedon continued its lazy, sun-drenched journey, oblivious to the second, hidden river now passing beneath it. An hour stretched into 2. The groans from the pipe lessened, replaced by a steady, deep hum. It was the sound of a system filled, pressurized, and alive. The water had descended from the northern tower, crossed the valley floor, and was now, against all instinct and common sense, climbing. It was fighting its way up the southern slope, a silent, invisible battle against gravity being waged within a lead tube buried 6 feet underground. Finally, Lucius placed his hand on the great bronze valve wheel. It was cold to the touch. He nodded to Sceva. "Centurion, the honor is yours." Sceva, a man more accustomed to breaking gates than opening them, stepped forward. He wrapped his powerful hands around the wheel. The assembled legionaries leaned forward, a collective holding of breath. Celsus nervously fingered the folds of his toga. With a grunt of effort, Sceva turned the wheel. It resisted, fighting him with the pent-up force of the entire system. His muscles bunched, the leather straps of his armor creaking. The wheel groaned, then slowly, grudgingly began to turn. A hiss escaped the valve, a sharp release of the last of the trapped air. And then came the water. It did not burst forth. It surged, a solid, crystal-clear column of impossible water, arcing gracefully from the outlet pipe into the stone basin built to receive it. It was not the trickle of a spring or the gush of a cistern. It was the steady, powerful, and relentless flow of a man-made river. Water that had begun its journey miles away in the mountains had plunged into the earth and had now been forced to climb a hill to serve a Roman city. A stunned silence fell over the crowd. They stared, mesmerized. The legionaries on the hillsides, the hardened veterans of Dacian campaigns and frontier skirmishes, looked down at the flowing water with expressions of utter disbelief. They had moved the stones, they had cast the lead, but they had never truly believed. Now they saw. Governor Celsus let out a long, slow breath, a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob of relief. He stepped forward and plunged his hands into the cool, flowing water, splashing it on his face as if to assure himself it was real.